Maybe some of you recognize this emblem. You'll find it stamped into literally thousands of kilometers of sidewalks across the country. And honestly, it's the reason that I really feel like I'm in such a rush these days. Whenever I pass one of these on the sidewalk, I speed up. And it's a funny thing, because the reason I'm rushing is still 8 years away. The story I want to tell this afternoon is the story of how, as Canadians, we're going to celebrate the 150th birthday of Confederation, Canada's sesquicentennial, and what we can learn from what Pierre Berton famously, and maybe a bit mischievously, called Canada's last good year, the centennial in 1967. The reason I care about it, and the reason I hope I can convince you to care about it too, is that 2017 may be the best opportunity we've got over the next decade to do some important work in this country. So I want to do 4 things. I want to talk about 2017 in political terms. I want to talk about 2017 in historical terms. I want to talk about it in terms of our sense of public imagination. And I want to talk about 2017 in generational terms. But before I do, I want to just go back 1 second, because it's important to ask why Berton called 1967 not just a good year, but the last good year. And it's a title that got him in trouble. And when the book came out in a second printing, the subtitle had been changed. 1967, the last good year, became 1967, Canada's turning point, which itself is a provocative title, but it's certainly not as pessimistic, nor perhaps as poignant as his first. Now, partly it helps to know that Berton was writing in the mid-90s. The book was published in 1997, so Berton wasn't just writing in the immediate afterglow of the centennial year. He was writing it retrospectively and casting back 30 years later, just 2 years after the trauma of the Quebec referendum and in the midst of the most serious cuts to public spending in a generation. And so in comparison to the 90s, the centennial era shone even brighter as a period of enormous political energy and public purpose. And it helps to remind ourselves just how much was taking place. In 1960, Canadians got the Bill of Rights, and First Nations were given the right to vote. In 1961, the first transatlantic phone system was inaugurated, and the Queen gave our Prime Minister a call. But only a year later, in 1962, we were the 3rd country to send a communication satellite into space. And 2 years after that, we started to carry social insurance cards in our pockets. In 1964, we saluted a new flag and Toronto built a new city hall. And in 1966, the CBC flipped the switch on colour. We got the Canada Pension Plan, the Bloor-Danforth line cut across Toronto, Montreal got Metro, and Canadians, we got Medicare. And in 1967, our centennial year, we sang a new anthem, we built a national library, we awarded the Order of Canada, and we attended one of the world's great fairs, Expo 67. And 1,000 people came to see the first 8 acts at Toronto's Caribana. But it continued, because in 1968 homosexuality was decriminalized and divorce was reformed. The Canadian forces were amalgamated, and we all started riding around on these funny double-decker green trains in Toronto called GO Transit. And in 1969, the National Arts Centre opened in Ottawa. Every bit as important to that era in the country as getting an opera house in Toronto was for our own. And the Official Languages Act came into effect. As a country, we started and ended the decade in very different places. It was an era of metamorphosis and reinvention. By the end of the decade, you had public health care, a pension plan, and social insurance. You had new national symbols, institutions, and awards. You had better infrastructure. You could travel more easily and communicate more effectively in 2 official languages. And little of this was because of Centennial. But what Centennial did was establish a milestone, a goalpost. It was powerful because it focused everyone's attention on 3 questions. At 100, where are we? Who are we? And where are we going? In this way, Centennial was a useful device. It had a political effect. It was catalytic because it gave us a public occasion to ask these questions in an open and free way, outside of the sort of public crisis that normally spurs these debates about radical change. Instead, the Spirit of Centennial allowed us to propose new ideas about how, as a society, we would live together. Or at least I think this is what two people, Roby Kidd and Frida Walden, may have had in mind. Roby and Frida probably did more to shape the Spirit of Centennial than anyone else, though I'm sure they'd refuse the credit. Roby was the first Canadian to get a PhD in adult education. He was what you might call a proto-social entrepreneur, because he's always starting new stuff. And Walden, she ran the Hamilton Public Library system, and she saw firsthand the transformative power of literacy and education. Kidd and Walden each understood the value of what today is called lifelong, self-directed learning, and they shared the belief that a good society is one that encourages curiosity, self-discovery, and improvement. Together, they were among the first people to recognize the opportunity that a Canadian centennial might contain, and I believe that in doing so they helped to set the stage for what would follow. You see, 10 years before Centennial, before anyone else, in 1957, they organized a conference that drew together 32 different organizations. And a year later, they met again, and soon after, the Canadian Centenary Council was created. It was a voluntary organization whose purpose was to get people thinking about 1967 and press the government to get moving. Because it wasn't government that led the way to 67. It was citizens, like Roby and Frida. And they managed to embed this idea that Centennial didn't belong to the government. It belonged to Canadians, and it would be up to Canadians to decide just how they intended to celebrate. Encouraging curiosity, self-discovery, and improvement was what they hoped Centennial would help to do. They envisioned a Centennial that would be about the excitement of learning. It would be about learning about oneself, one's neighbors, and one's country. And you could do this without ever taking out a textbook. And what's so extraordinary is that when Canadians, by the millions, took up this invitation exceeding anyone's expectations in Ottawa, and staged thousands of community events and initiatives, they began to see for themselves that despite their differences from one region to the next, what they shared was this desire to celebrate. And for Canadians in 1967, it didn't matter if your way of celebrating was to build a UFO pad in St. Paul, Alberta, or stage a bathtub race in BC, or launch a Caribbean festival in Toronto, or a historic reenactment in PEI. The point was the people were taking charge. They were spontaneously, joyously, mixing, and burning their own centennials clear across the country. And if it was Expo, that extraordinary and visionary fair that created the most artifacts and affection and drew the most media attention and lodged in our minds this idea of global citizenship, citizens of the world with passports in hand, it was these community initiatives that created the real sense of belonging to the country we call home. Inspired by Roby and Frida, the government got this. They understood that their job wasn't to lead, but to convene. And let me show you what I mean by this. You know, we're also used to living with the syntax of the government as a mildly patronizing provider. Brought to you by the Government of Canada, taking care of you and your hard-working family. That we've forgotten what simple, sincere communication can look like. Take a look at this ad. It says, it's time to reflect on past achievements of our growth into a modern, dynamic country and to look ahead to a future of prosperity and greatness. So what are you planning for Centennial? You see, what Centennial had was this DIY 60s steal this book ethic. In fact, the government actually took out ads asking people to steal, or rather use the Centennial logo for anything they liked. It was effectively open source. Wear it, hang it, stencil it, carry it, wave it, but above all, please use it. Just try that with the Olympic rings. You see, I think that the real legacy of Centennial was that it gave Canadians permission to be imaginative and to do their own thing, just at the same time, so we could learn from one another. And you know, last year, we watched an election in the US where the president challenged Americans to have what he called the audacity of hope. But I don't know if this scans as well in Canada, because by and large Canadians, we have hope. What we sometimes forget, however, is the audacity of our imagination, because it's always been this sense of imagination and our commitment to fair play and our hard-headed northern attitude to mucking in and solving problems that makes Canada what it is. And as Canadians, I think we're at our best when we follow the logic of fair play and allow it to carry us to radical conclusions, when we use our imagination to push beyond old divides and create new conventions and social commitments. And I'd like to argue that in the run-up to 2017, we need to give ourselves permission to really get imaginative as a country again. And I'm a bit stunned to give you this next example because, well, it comes from a bank. It's not exactly your usual source of wild-eyed aspirational thinking. But it talks about our country's cultural deficits, things which a country settled nearly 350 years ago and politically united nearly 100 years ago should have by this time. Organizations like and physical properties for the production of music and plays and ballet and all expressions of our artistic nature, for the training and use of athletes, for the development of minds through lectures, study groups, and exhibitions. And they continue to write, instead of bronze plaques and marble monuments, we might unveil significant community improvements like new parks, new houses replacing slums, new city halls, new community buildings, libraries, museums. And this is the most extraordinary line, because they write, these are things we want anyway. And preparation for our centennial gives us the opportunity and incentive to get them now. You know, it's a bit startling to realize that a grey 1960s bank has something to teach us today about thinking not only big, but about how we frame and imagine our collective aspirations. And today, as then, there is no shortage of opportunities and injustices to address. Some are in our backyards, and others are going to require wholesale political change and new institutional settlements. But my point, like the banks, is that the sesquicentennial is a good excuse for going after them. I want to quickly show you some posters, in part because they're gorgeous, but also because they do a good job conveying this energy. And finally, this ad, because it's earnest, almost beyond belief. It says, in 1967, we learned a lot about ourselves as a nation. Let's not stop now. Let's enjoy this new knowledge of ourselves and make every year to come one of excitement and discovery. We'll just call it 1968, Centennial +1, and keep on going. It's just this incredible enthusiasm and tenderness about it all. And you know, I think it's important to reject the idea that having any affection for this syntax, for this way of relating or describing public goals or shared purpose is somehow nostalgic or out of date. Instead, I think it's a challenge to us to take this syntax and make it our own. You see, we might already have a flag and an anthem. In our first 150 years, we've assembled all the pieces and built a country together. Not a perfect one, but one that's ours, and ours still to shape. And by saying this, I'm tipping my hand to my final point. When I say that we need to think about 2017 in generational terms, I don't mean just a handover from baby boomers to their kids. That's happening, and it will, I hope, accelerate. What I mean is that for Canada, in our first 100 years, geography was often destiny. But since 1967, demography has been king and continues to reshape this country more radically than any other force. Just look at the growth of this country over the past 150 years. We'll be 10 times larger 150 years later. And each year, 250,000 new citizens makes Canada their home. This is more per capita than any other country in the world, and we're now adding 1 million new Canadians to this country in the time that it takes to get a university degree. And since 1967, fully 1/3 of the country was born abroad, and today 8% of our population lives abroad. This is extraordinary. That's twice as many per capita as any other G8 nation. It's also more than the size of Atlantic Canada, or the population of Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the north combined. Demography is destiny, but I contend it's combining with our love of geography in radical new ways. We're the one country where when you recite the names of towns and cities across the lengths of 6 time zones, hearts flutter. When you say the words Whitehorse, Edmonton, Thunder Bay, Rimouski, and Gander, you feel something, even if you've never been there. And yet, we now live in a time when to say the words Mombasa, Beirut, London, Hong Kong, Mexico City stirs Canadian hearts as well. My point is that demography is actually expanding our geography, and with it, our sense of public imagination. It's changing how we will define our relationship with the state and citizenship in the 21st century. And we are absolutely the right country to take this next step forward. And as it was in 1967, it may well be again. Global immigration and multiculturalism were once radical and new, and so it made sense to look more closely and discover and learn from where and how Canadians were living from one side of the country to the other. That was Centennial's overarching theme. But the reality of this legacy 50 years later is a new Canadian diaspora and a new Canadian citizenry. Our citizens live and work abroad as never before. And so circulation and multinationalism may seem as radical and foreign today as multiculturalism did in the 60s, but I'm willing to bet we will come to recognize them equally as a source of strength. And so in 1967, in 2017, we need to look again at home and abroad and rediscover and learn from where and how Canadians are really living today. Or at least, it's a good place to start. So what's next? Well, we need to get this show underway. Next March, we've booked the National Arts Centre in Ottawa for 2 days and are inviting 300 public servants, business leaders, scientists, artists, and writers. And we're going to get to work. It's the first major initiative to begin imagining and planning 2017, and believe me, you are all invited. If you can't make it, then steal a page from the Centennial and Today. Create a 150X conference in your own community. Just remember 3 things. 1. Centennials belong to citizens. Together we should use the sesquicentennial to ask those 3 powerful questions. Where are we? Who are we? And just where is it that we're headed? 2. Without culture, politics is a spent force. You can't achieve anything meaningful in politics unless you've got people singing or stomping for it. Because culture is the wellspring for our political imagination, and in 1967, culture and politics were fellow travelers. They can be united again. 3rd and finally, too often, societies are forced to make their biggest decisions in a time of crisis. And crises can be useful. This is why Rahm Emanuel called the current economic crisis in the US a terrible thing to waste. But what I'm talking about today is the exact opposite of a crisis. Our anniversary can be a catalyst. If we roll up our sleeves and get started now, we can make 2017 Canada's next turning point. It can be Canada's next great year.